The fluorescent lights in the precinct conference room buzzed softly. Officer Daniel Carter sat stiffly in the chair, his hands clasped together on the table, his heart pounding in his chest. Across from him sat Olivia Marshall, the precinct's captain, along with James Lawson, an internal affairs investigator. Their eyes were sharp, filled with scrutiny. The silence was suffocating. Carter swallowed hard. He had faced criminals, high-speed chases, and life-or-death situations. But nothing felt as daunting as this moment. The door creaked open. Ethan Cole stepped inside, his expression calm but unreadable. His presence was commanding, exuding an air of quiet authority that made Carter's stomach twist. Marshall folded her hands together. "Officer Carter," she began, her voice even. "Do you understand why you're here today?" Carter licked his dry lips. "Yes, ma'am." Lawson flipped open a file, his gaze never leaving Carter. "Tell us about the incident in the park," he said. "Tell us why you arrested Special Agent Ethan Cole." Carter blinked. "Special Agent?" Ethan sat down across from him, folding his hands on the table. "Yes, Officer Carter," he said smoothly. "I'd like to hear it too." Carter's mind reeled, flashing back to that afternoon. The sun, the bench, the man reading a book, and the mistake that would change his life forever. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues across Riverside Park. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves as children laughed in the distance. The world felt peaceful. Ethan Cole sat alone on a weathered wooden bench, flipping a page of his book. He exhaled softly, savoring the quiet moment. His work as an FBI special agent rarely allowed such luxuries. But today, he wasn't here for work. Today, he was just a man enjoying a book in the park. From across the green expanse, Officer Daniel Carter walked his patrol route. His sharp blue eyes swept over the people around him, instinctively scanning for anything unusual. And then he saw him. A black man, alone, reading a book. Something tightened in Carter's chest. Why did this feel off? He had walked this beat for years. He knew the regulars, the joggers, the dog walkers, the elderly couples who fed the ducks. But this man? Carter had never seen him before. His pulse quickened. Was he waiting for someone? Hiding something? Carter's mind flickered back to a case from years ago, a suspect who had caught him off guard. A black man, calm and unreadable, had lured him into lowering his guard before attacking. Was this another one of those moments? His instincts screamed at him. Trust the gut. It's never been wrong before. He adjusted his grip on his baton and took a step forward. Ethan noticed the officer the moment he stopped walking. He could feel the weight of Carter's stare. The same look he had seen so many times before. Suspicion disguised as vigilance. Prejudice masked as concern. He sighed inwardly, closing his book slowly. Not again. Carter approached, his posture rigid. "Afternoon, sir," he said. His tone was polite, but Ethan heard the underlying edge. "Afternoon," Ethan replied evenly. "You live around here?" Ethan studied the officer's face. The question wasn't casual. It was probing. "I've been around," Ethan said, keeping his voice neutral. Carter's eyes flickered with something. Irritation? Suspicion? "You mind showing me some ID?" Ethan let out a slow breath. Here it was. The moment. "Am I under arrest?" Carter stiffened. "Not if you cooperate." Ethan didn't flinch. He knew his rights. And he knew how this could go very, very wrong. "There's no law against sitting on a bench," Ethan said. "You fit a description." Carter shot back, his voice growing sharper. Ethan arched an eyebrow. "And what description is that?" Carter's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer. The tension in the air thickened. A small crowd began to form at a distance. A woman pulled out her phone. Recording. Carter felt his authority slipping. And it only fueled his frustration. His hand moved to his holster. "Last chance," he snapped. "Show me some ID." Ethan could have refused. He could have asserted his rights. But he knew how this would end. Silently, he reached for his wallet and handed over his ID. Carter snatched it. He scanned the name. Ethan Cole. It meant nothing to him. "Stand up," Carter ordered. Ethan sighed. "Here we go." He rose slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate. "Turn around," Carter said, pulling out his handcuffs. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, then did as he was told. Click. The cuffs snapped around his wrists. And just like that, a federal agent had been arrested for sitting on a bench. As Carter led Ethan toward the patrol car, He could feel eyes on him. People were whispering, watching. A little girl held her mother's hand. Her big brown eyes filled with confusion. "Mommy, why is that man being arrested?" Her mother didn't answer. Inside the car, Ethan stared out the window as the park blurred past. Carter's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled. His mind racing. Why did this still feel off? His gut had never failed him before. But something in the calmness of Ethan Cole gnawed at him. "All right," Carter muttered, glancing in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" Ethan met his gaze, his voice unreadable. "I told you." A pause. Then, with a hint of irony, "Just reading." Carter scoffed. "A guy like you? Just sitting around reading?" Ethan tilted his head slightly. "A guy like me?" Carter hesitated. He had said too much. And for the first time, doubt began to creep in. The precinct was alive with the usual hum of voices, the ringing of phones, and the hurried shuffling of officers moving between desks. It was routine, predictable, until Daniel Carter walked through the door with a handcuffed Ethan Cole in tow. Carter moved with the confidence of a man convinced he had just made an important arrest. Ethan, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. His silence unnerved Carter more than he cared to admit. At the processing desk, Alex Reed, the young officer on duty, glanced up from his paperwork. When his gaze landed on Ethan, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He reached for the ID Carter had handed over and casually ran it through the system. Then, he froze. The blood drained from Reed's face as he stared at the screen, his eyes darting between the name on the ID and the information now staring back at him. He slowly looked up at Carter, a mixture of disbelief and dread clouding his features. Carter?" Reed's voice had lost its casual edge. Carter, still high on his self-righteousness, crossed his arms. "Yeah?" Reed hesitated. He wasn't sure how to say it. But he had no choice. He turned the screen toward Carter. "You just arrested a federal agent." Carter blinked. The words didn't register immediately. "What?" Reed exhaled, lowering his voice. "Daniel, you just put cuffs on a special agent Ethan Cole of the FBI." The room seemed to close in around Carter. His stomach twisted. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He turned sharply to Ethan, who stood there watching him, his face unreadable. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of Ethan's lips. "Still think I was up to something?" he asked smoothly. Carter's throat went dry. His gut had never been wrong before. But today, it had betrayed him. Carter stormed into Olivia Marshall's office, his mind still reeling. The precinct captain sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable as she finished reading the report Reed had just handed her. She looked up, her sharp brown eyes locking onto Carter. "Sit." Carter hesitated but obeyed. Marshall tossed the file onto her desk. "Would you like to explain why you arrested a high-ranking FBI agent for reading in a park?" Carter shifted in his seat. "Captain, he was what, Carter?" Marshall cut him off, her voice cool but edged with dangerous patience. "Sitting too quietly? Reading too suspiciously?" Carter clenched his jaw. He matched the description of bullshit, she snapped, leaning forward. "You know damn well you had nothing on him. You saw a black man sitting alone. And instead of treating him like any other citizen, you went in with suspicion. And now? Now we have a disaster on our hands." Carter's fists tightened. "I wasn't profiling him." Marshall scoffed. "Then tell me, if he had been a white guy in a suit, would you have done the same thing?" Silence. Carter wanted to argue, to fight back, but the truth pressed against his ribs like a weight he couldn't shake. Marshall exhaled sharply. "Agent Cole has agreed not to escalate this to the press, yet. But make no mistake, Internal Affairs is going to dig into this. And if they find anything in your past that suggests a pattern, your career is over." A muscle twitched in Carter's jaw. He wasn't a racist. He had spent 20 years on the force. He had saved lives. He had risked his own. But none of that mattered if he was wrong today. Marshall leaned back, her gaze softening, just slightly. "I suggest you think long and hard about why you did what you did today, Carter, because if you don't, you might not just lose your job." Carter's throat tightened. What else is there to lose? Marshall held his gaze. "The ability to look at yourself in the mirror." Carter swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he could anymore. Ethan sat in the precinct's side room, his hands free now, but his patience running thin. He had been through too many situations like this. But today was different. Because this time, he had leverage. The door opened, and Carter walked in, his face unreadable. Ethan studied him carefully. The man looked like he had been hit by a freight train of realization. "You didn't know," Ethan said simply. Carter looked at him, his jaw tight. "No." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "But let me ask you something. Officer Carter, if I hadn't been an FBI agent, if I had just been a regular guy in that park, how far would you have taken it?" Carter said nothing, because he knew the answer. "Too far." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "You got lucky today, but you're not the first cop to do this. And you won't be the last. The question is," his gaze hardened, "are you gonna be the kind that learns from this? Or the kind that keeps making the same mistake until it destroys you?" Carter clenched his fists. Ethan leaned back. "Think about it." Carter turned and walked out. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The precinct buzzed with murmured conversations. The weight of the recent events hung in the air like an oppressive storm cloud. Officers exchanged glances as Daniel Carter walked through the hallways, his presence now attracting an entirely different kind of attention. He could feel it, the shift. It wasn't just a normal day at the station anymore. The tension followed him, pressing down on his shoulders, an invisible weight that hadn't been there before. Some officers nodded at him, expressions tight but supportive. Others avoided his gaze, their silence heavier than words ever could be. And then there were those who watched him with something different. Judgment, suspicion, even resentment. For years, Carter had walked these halls with unquestioned authority. He had been a respected officer, a man known for his instincts and his dedication to the job. But today, he was a man under investigation. Today, he was a cop whose name was whispered in hushed voices, whose legacy was suddenly in question. He felt the sharp gaze of Detective James Lawson before he even turned the corner. The internal affairs investigator leaned against the wall near Captain Olivia Marshall's office, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Carter," Lawson greeted, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp with calculated interest. Carter's jaw tightened. "Lawson, you've had an eventful couple of days," Lawson mused, pushing off the wall, "and something tells me they're about to get a lot more interesting." Carter exhaled slowly, already bracing himself. "Yeah? And why's that?" Lawson smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was knowing. "Because now, your past is an open book," Lawson said smoothly, "and I get to read every page." Carter's stomach clenched. "I was doing my job," Carter said evenly, his voice betraying none of the anxiety bubbling inside him. Lawson studied him for a long moment before nodding. "That's what they all say," he said, "right up until they're signing their resignation papers." Carter's fists clenched at his sides. But he forced himself to stay calm. He wouldn't let them take him down that easily. Not without a fight. But the question that gnawed at him now, the one he couldn't shake, was this really a fight he deserved to win? Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Ethan Cole sat at his desk in a dimly lit office. The quiet hum of a ceiling fan overhead filled the silence as he scrolled through his phone, watching the video that had been recorded in Riverside Park. The footage had already made its way online. It was everywhere. Thousands of comments, shares, outrage. Some people were angry at Carter. Some were angry at the system itself. And some were still defending Carter, twisting the narrative, making Ethan out to be the villain. Another thug trying to play the victim. Maybe if he had just cooperated, this wouldn't have happened. He probably did something shady before the camera started rolling. Ethan exhaled slowly, closing his eyes against the familiar exhaustion. No matter how high he climbed, no matter how much he accomplished, this was always waiting for him. A reminder that his success didn't erase his skin color. That, to people like Carter, he would always be a suspect first and a person second. His phone buzzed. A call from Captain Olivia Marshall. Ethan picked up. "Captain, Agent Cole," Olivia greeted, her voice carefully neutral. "I need to know where you stand on this. Are you pressing charges?" Ethan rubbed his temple. "That depends. On what? On whether or not you're actually going to do something about it." Ethan said plainly, "Because if this gets swept under the rug, I'll make sure it doesn't go away quietly." There was a pause on the other end. "I understand," Olivia finally said. "Just give me time to handle this the right way." Ethan sighed. "You have 72 hours. Captain." Another pause. Then, Understood. Back at the precinct, Carter sat at his desk, the weight of the room pressing in on him. He wasn't alone. 2 officers stood nearby, their conversation just loud enough for him to hear. I mean, what was he supposed to do? Just let the guy walk away? One officer scoffed. Yeah, but he was an FBI agent. The other one countered. That's a whole different ballgame. So what? We're supposed to start letting guys off the hook just because they have a badge? You don't get it, the second officer insisted. This isn't just about Cole. This is about how we look. And right now, we look like a damn joke. Carter's fingers curled into a fist against the desk. It didn't matter what side they were on. All of them were talking about him. You all right there, Carter? He looked up to see Officer Greg Hastings, one of his closest colleagues, standing by his desk. Hastings wasn't just another cop. He was one of Carter's few real friends on the force. Carter forced a smirk. Yeah, just another day in paradise. Hastings didn't smile. This isn't just another day. Carter leaned back, crossing his arms. So what, Hastings? You think I deserve to get hung out to dry over this? Hastings hesitated, and that pause cut deeper than anything he could have said outright. I think, Hastings said carefully, that you need to ask yourself why you did it. Carter stiffened. I told you. You told yourself. Hastings cut in. But is that really the truth? Carter's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend himself. But something in Hastings' eyes made him stop. Because he wasn't accusing Carter. He was challenging him. And for the first time, Carter didn't have an answer. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold, sterile glow over Daniel Carter as he sat in the small, windowless interview room deep inside the precinct. The chair beneath him was uncomfortable, stiff, almost as if it was designed to make the person sitting in it feel out of place. Right now, he did. Across the table sat Detective James Lawson, the man from Internal Affairs, the one with the unnerving ability to peel back layers until nothing was left but the truth, whether you liked it or not. Lawson took his time, flipping through the thick file in front of him, dragging out the silence like an executioner sharpening his blade. Carter hated that. You know, Lawson finally said, still not looking up. I've seen a lot of cases like yours. Carter stiffened, fingers tightening around his own wrist. Like mine? Yeah. Lawson finally looked up, his expression unreadable. Cops who think they've got a good instinct, who think they're keeping the city safe. Carter narrowed his eyes. That's what we do. Lawson tapped a finger against the open file. Is it? Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Lawson turned one of the pages, spinning the file toward Carter so he could see it clearly. Carter's gut clenched. A list of complaints, spanning back years, all staring back at him. Some he remembered vaguely. Others, he had convinced himself never happened. I didn't. Carter stopped himself. His voice sounded weaker than he wanted. Lawson leaned back in his chair, watching him carefully. You didn't what, Carter? Carter exhaled sharply. I didn't act out of bias. Lawson cocked an eyebrow. So explain these to me. He flipped through a few of the complaints. 2 years ago, an excessive force complaint from a 21-year-old black college student. 3 years ago, another one, wrongful detainment. 5 years ago, same thing, different name. Carter gritted his teeth. Those were all investigated. Nothing was ever proven. Lawson tilted his head slightly. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. Carter leaned forward, his blood simmering. You want to act like I'm some kind of racist? That I go around targeting black men for no reason? Lawson's gaze didn't waver. I think you believe you're a good cop. I think you believe you're doing the right thing. But tell me, Carter, when was the last time your instincts led you to arrest a white man for doing nothing? Carter had no answer. Because he knew the truth. And the truth didn't care how good of a cop he thought he was. The air in the small community center was thick with tension. The kind that preceded either progress or disaster. Ethan Cole stood at the front of the room, facing a group of local activists, legal representatives, and concerned citizens. Some were familiar faces, people he had worked with before. Others, strangers who had come because they wanted change. Let's not pretend this is new, Ethan said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Because it's not. What happened to me happens every day. The only reason this is getting attention is because I have a badge. A woman in the crowd, Nia Caldwell, a well-known activist, leaned forward. So what do we do about it? Ethan looked around the room, his gaze steady. We use this. We make sure the department doesn't just push it under the rug like they always do. We make sure Carter isn't just a scapegoat they throw to the wolves while they keep the system intact." A man in the back scoffed. "So what? We just keep waiting for change?" "No," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We make it happen." Another voice chimed in. "And if they don't listen?" Ethan exhaled. "Then we make sure the whole damn country does." Carter sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of the television casting flickering shadows across the walls. His badge sat on the table in front of him, a small but heavy symbol of everything he had built, everything he had believed in. And now? Now, he wasn't even sure who he was anymore. The words from Lawson, from Hastings, even from Ethan, all swirled in his head, refusing to be ignored. Was he really the man he thought he was? Or had he been lying to himself this whole time? A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He opened it to find Olivia Marshall standing there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Carter," she said. "Captain." She walked in without waiting for an invitation. "Do you know what's happening outside right now?" Carter rubbed his temples. "Let me guess. Protests?" She exhaled, nodding. "The city is watching us." "Carter, watching you. And Internal Affairs isn't the only group interested in what happens next." Carter sat down heavily on his couch. "You here to tell me I'm done?" Marshall hesitated. "I'm here to tell you that who you are now will determine who you are for the rest of your life." Carter looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said slowly, "that if you're willing to face what you've done, to actually learn from it, then maybe you can still have a future. But if you keep pretending you've done nothing wrong, then you were never meant to wear that badge in the first place." Carter stared at her, his throat tightening. "You're at a crossroads, Carter," she said, "and I can't tell you which way to go. But you're the only one who can live with the choice you make." She turned to leave. Before she walked out, she stopped at the door. Think about it. Then she was gone. And Carter was left alone with a choice he never thought he'd have to make. The city streets were alive with the hum of anger, frustration, and hope. Hundreds of people gathered outside the police precinct, their voices rising in a chorus of demands for justice. Some carried signs with bold, unforgiving letters: "End police brutality. No more profiling. Justice for all." Others chanted, their voices pounding against the walls of the very institution they had lost faith in. From his position inside the station, Daniel Carter watched through a slatted window. The sheer number of people unsettling. It wasn't just anger. It was a reckoning. He spotted Ethan Cole at the front, standing near the press, his face calm but his stance unshakable. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned in, eager to capture every word. Carter couldn't hear him from inside. But he didn't need to. He already knew what Ethan was saying. Because for the first time in his life, he was finally listening. A door opened behind him. He turned to see Olivia Marshall, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold outside. "It's not going away," she murmured. Carter swallowed hard. "No, it's not." Marshall's gaze slid to him, searching his expression. "Internal Affairs is finalizing their report. You'll have your answer by tomorrow morning." Carter exhaled. The moment was here. "Do I even have a chance?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he even wanted the answer. Marshall didn't sugarcoat it. "You'll get whatever you deserve, Carter. That's how this works." He nodded slowly. But the question clawing at him now wasn't whether he'd keep his badge. It was whether he even deserved to. Morning came like a slow-moving storm. The precinct was quieter than usual. The hushed conversations, the sideways glances, the tension, they all told Carter what he already knew. The decision had been made. As he stepped into the conference room, he was met with the cool, unreadable stares of the review board. James Lawson sat at the head of the table, flanked by two high-ranking officials. And then there was Ethan Cole, seated near the side, watching him closely. Carter forced himself to hold that gaze, despite the weight pressing against his chest. "Officer Carter," Lawson began, flipping through his file. "After thorough review of the body cam footage, witness testimonies, and your prior history, the department has reached a decision regarding your status within the force." Carter's heart pounded. Lawson let the silence stretch before he finally spoke. "You are hereby terminated from the department. Effective immediately." Carter's breath left him in a slow, measured exhale. The words hit like a sledgehammer. But deep down, he already knew this was coming. His fingers curled slightly against the table. He felt the heat of shame regret, and something else entirely, relief. Relief that the lie was over. He had spent years convincing himself he was a good cop, that his actions had always been about justice, about keeping people safe. But now, stripped of the badge, stripped of his armor, he was finally forced to face what he had refused to before. He had been wrong. Carter's throat was dry. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply nodded. Lawson glanced toward Olivia Marshall, who stood near the doorway, her expression firm. "You may turn in your badge and weapon at the front desk," she said. "You'll be escorted out afterward." Carter stood slowly, pushing back his chair. And then, for the first time since this all began, he turned to Ethan. "I was wrong," he said, his voice rough, raw. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Ethan studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Good," he said. "Now do something with it." Carter wasn't sure what that meant yet. But as he walked out of that room, out of the precinct for the last time, he knew one thing. His story wasn't over yet. 1 week later, Riverside Park, the very place where this all started. The evening sun cast long shadows across the bench as Ethan Cole sat quietly, watching the world move around him. And then, unexpectedly, a familiar figure approached. Daniel Carter. No uniform, no badge, just a man, trying to figure out who he was without it. Ethan looked up as Carter hesitated near the bench. "Mind if I sit?" Carter asked. Ethan gestured to the open space beside him. "Free country." A silence stretched between them before Carter spoke. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted, voice quieter than usual. Ethan nodded. "That's the point." Carter exhaled, watching the city around him. "I don't want to be that guy anymore." "Then don't be," Ethan said simply. Carter let out a bitter chuckle. "It's not that easy." "No," Ethan agreed, "but it's possible." For a long time, they just sat there. Two men, two paths that had collided, shattered, and rebuilt into something new. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carter let go of the past and finally looked toward the future. This story wasn't just about Daniel Carter or Ethan Cole. It was about something bigger than them both. It was about the power of assumptions. It was about accountability and change. It was about the difference between who we think we are and who we truly are. We all carry biases, whether we admit it or not. Some are unconscious, some are learned, and some are so deeply rooted that we don't even recognize them until we are forced to confront them. But here's the truth. Admitting you were wrong doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger. Growth isn't easy. It's painful. It's messy. But it's necessary. Change starts with accountability. You can't fix a problem if you refuse to see it. Carter thought he was a good cop, that he was only following his instincts. But instincts built on prejudice and fear will never lead to justice. And justice is what we all deserve. A message to you. If you've made it this far, thank you. This story was more than just entertainment. It was a reflection of the world we live in. And whether you're a cop, a lawyer, a student, or just someone trying to navigate life, I hope this made you think. I hope it made you ask yourself, have I ever judged someone before truly knowing them? Have I ever let my own fears cloud my judgment? Am I willing to learn, to grow, and to change? Because that's what really matters. Change isn't just for people like Carter. It's for all of us. And if he can learn, so can we. Join the conversation. What are your thoughts on this story? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Don't forget to like the video if this story made you think. Subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge perspectives and spark real conversations. Because at the end of the day, stories create change. And you are part of that change. See you in the next one.